he could be described as boring, couldn't he, in a way, I suppose.
Well, he does, and then you meet him face to face. I met him that one time
not.
face to face.
Yeah.
He came into London, me and Ray were there.
Yeah.
And he had some beers. I got a selfie with him.
Yeah.
I even showed him, I took the selfie with him. I sent it to my mate who works for an Ericsson owned company. And I said, I'm with your boss. He says you're shit. And then my mate replied and he went, tell him to give me a fucking pay rise. And I showed Boy Ekholm that, and he threw his head back and pissed himself laughing. And then he suddenly corrected himself and went, oh, but tell him to speak to his manager. And I was like, don't worry, Boy, your first response was fine. Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast in a new studio. We're now at, 240 Blackfriars Road,
Mm-hmm.
Which is arguably an even shinier and more corporate looking building.
It's very phallic.
Exactly. Great big shiny shaft.
We're close to the tip.
Going up into the sky, and we're close to the bell end.
It's more like a rectangular to me.
I know, I was kind of stretching the phallic thing a little bit. Well, he started it.
Sorry.
Yes, and it's got some clever things, like when you check through your card, it then automatically tells you what lift you're going to get. And then you get in, it just takes you there.
Yeah, I still don't know what happens if you get in with people who are going to different floors.
Well, I'm so pleased you asked, because I did exactly that. I sort of went through the gate, and there are a bunch of people getting in a lift, so I thought I'll just get in that one. And then I got in, and there were a few of them, and I couldn't see any buttons. And I asked one of the people, is the button behind you? And they gave me this sort of pitying, that they're all in their 20s. They gave me this sort of, oh, bless him, look.
So you have to actually pay attention to the thing that comes up on.
Well, no, the thing is that they're all going to floor 17, and there's no buttons in the lift.
Yeah.
It predetermines it by you checking through the gate what lift you're going to get into.
No. That's because your pass is
for 15.
Yeah, but there's a screen where you could pick any floor at the bottom.
Yeah. But I didn't. What I didn't know. Yeah, there is a screen. But what I didn't know is there were no buttons inside the lift.
Oh yeah.
So I was just going to wing it, like the old days.
Yeah.
I remember days when you had a
touch
special
screens.
bloke in there with a hat on.
Yeah. Like on
That's
Titanic.
what I want.
A lift driver.
Yeah, the lift. That's why there's so much
Like
unemployment
bus
these days, because we got rid of those jobs. Bloody automation, Ian.
It is automation, yeah.
So anyway, but no, it looks like a cool office, and we're up on the 15th floor, so we get to look imperiously out over London.
What do you think of sitting on a bench rather than a chair?
Yeah, I mean,
It's got a bit of a sort of changing room feel.
it is a bit
Chelsea
locker room,
football,
isn't it?
yeah.
Chelsea locker room, which is the closest I'll ever get to it.
It's temporary.
Well, we'll see, because I don't know if there's enough room in here for us to drag in like office chairs. Anyway, we'll wait.
It must be bigger than the other one.
We're going to get rid of the bench.
Oh, they're getting rid of the bench?
Eventually, yeah.
Well, you didn't tell me. What am I, a mind reader?
Probably did, you just forgot.
So, but yeah, it's all good.
Yeah. It's been sorted out quickly. I mean,
Yeah, as well. Credit to Pierre, he's had to come in like on Wednesday and get everything going.
Yeah.
Because we did have a sudden, that office we used to be in. We're not in it anymore. Email. That was about it, wasn't it?
Don't come back.
Yeah, don't come there. Now it's just covered with snarling Dobermans and hostile security guards. So there we are. But no, I think this looks like a cool office. So hurrah!
Yeah.
What else? We're officially like post Rona in the UK right now. I was just reading something in the Spectator about New Zealand.
Post Rona restrictions, anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I've had it.
There's a good one
so
on
I'm
China.
fine. I'm all right, Jack. You what?
I bet the article you're going to refer to there's a similar themed one from a magazine called Foreign Affairs about China and how they're basically completely screwed.
No, I was going to talk about an article in this week's Spectator about New Zealand.
Right.
And
Who's screwed?
They're making, if someone tests positive, they got a lockdown for 14 days. Anyone they know has got locked down for 24 days.
Right.
And anyone who tests positive in that time, it gets reset. I mean, the whole country's going to be locked down.
It's the same as China. So China's the only big country in the world that's still trying to pursue a zero COVID policy.
Because they can.
Well, they can, but the trouble is there's a big piece in Foreign Affairs, which is quite a good, it's very economisty
Yeah, I'm
style.
not familiar with it.
But as soon as, I mean, how long can they go on doing this? And it also makes the population incredibly vulnerable to Omicron. Because one of the reasons we're not like
'cause
suffering much with
drip-fed
Omicron is being drip-fed the virus for like 2 years, as well as vaccines. But nobody's been exposed to it in China relative to the size of the population.
Well, who's going to make us
So
stop?
if they eventually do let these people leave their homes and go and do their jobs and get on with their lives as normal, they're all going to kind of keel over.
Look, I mean, I know there've been various discussions over the years, but I don't think it's very contentious in an epidemiological sense to say that something as infectious as a respiratory virus, let alone Omicron, which seems to be you can catch it just by watching it on telly by the looks of it. Pierre keeps trying to trash the studio because his wires are too short. You can't do zero COVID.
No.
I don't think even New Zealand can. Apparently they're just banning all, like, no one's flying in.
I think they've just completely lost
They're
the plot.
basically just eating lamb and kiwis.
They've lost the plot in New Zealand, I'm afraid. I mean, the Australians have kind of lost the plot as well.
Jacinda Ardern, it just seems mental.
Yeah.
Anyway.
250 days of lockdown Melbourne's had, in the last 2 years.
I know.
I mean, imagine going through that, though.
But it's even more absurd. I know China's more authoritarian by nature, but it's even more absurd for them doing it with the amount of land borders. You can understand the Aussies and the Kiwis thinking, well, we're islands,
Yeah.
so we can keep the rest of the world at bay. Obviously, that doesn't work if they want to import.
Yeah, what I can't understand
Goods
is doing it in a democracy, though. I mean, the
Yes.
Chinese just impose these rules and
everyone's
draconian
just got to deal with
restrictions
it.
on people because they can. But people in Australia and New Zealand, they're like Western-style democracies, and they've had the army on the streets. You come out your home, you get arrested.
Well, according to this Economist Spectator bit, the both populations, but especially the Kiwis, are quite compliant. You wouldn't expect it, would you?
Well,
The best
I wouldn't
rugby
expect
team
it,
in the
but-
world. You expect them to be full of sort of fight and
Well,
defiance.
they're compliant up to the point. It's going to change at some point. People, it can't last forever.
You'd think. Anyway, we'll see. But I'm grateful for all his many failings, and the fact that barely a Monday goes past without him being on the lash with all his mates. Bojo's made the right call on this.
Yeah.
And
Well, I think even epidemiologists in this country are now starting to change their tune and say that with this new variant, this sub-variant of Omicron called BA2 is even more infectious.
Right, I hadn't even heard of
apparently.
BA2.
Yeah.
It makes Omicron look like
It's
walk in a
almost
park.
the same, but it's a bit more transmissible. And it's got to the stage now where epidemiologists, they're quoted today in a BBC story actually saying the only restriction that would make sense now to try and stop the spread is a full lockdown.
Yeah.
And we're not going to do that.
No.
So, but all this stuff about face masks and not standing next to somebody and all this bollocks,
Yeah,
it's just a
it's
complete
just not
waste
gonna
of time. It's
They'll
futile.
sneak
They
outside
do that
and
in
get-
Spain where they wear face masks everywhere and they have more
I
infections than here at
know.
the
Well,
moment.
we'll see. We'll see how World Congress. We're a month away from World Congress.
Well, we'll have to wear them everywhere, I'm afraid, mate, when we're there.
God. Well, mate, I'm just still kind of hoping that in the intervening month they chill out a little.
No, they
bit.
won't, because that in place most of last year as well, so I don't see it changing.
But things can change fairly quickly. Come
Yeah,
on.
but even if the
Come on,
rules
give me
change,
some-
it's a cultural thing.
to
Spanish
cling to.
people beat you
I'm
up
with you,
if you don't
Scott.
wear it.
Yeah,
It's going to happen.
we'll see. One thing I do know, because I go over to Spain with Canary Islands, is the Guardia Civil are a seriously humorless bunch.
Exactly. Yeah.
And if you transgress, they'll quite happily fucking sort you out.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Legacy of Franco.
yeah, exactly. There's an Anglo-Aussie pundit who I quite respect called Helen Dale, and she was quoted not too long ago when people were going, "What the fuck's going on in Australia?" She was going, "Well, don't worry, don't forget, we're not just the descendants of conflicts; we're the descendants of their jailers as well." And I thought,
It's in the
fair
DNA.
point. Fair point. I mean, I think it's a bit harsh
Yeah.
to define the Aussies. I mean, we do it when we want to wind them up, but it's a bit harsh to define the Aussies as all just sort of
They're all prisoners, all jailers.
one sort of genetic jump removed from some sort of rabid lunatic. But yes, I suppose they've always had that dynamic historically in Australia of
Well, they've basically reverted to being the world's biggest penal colony.
indeed.
So,
There we go.
just talking about telecom.
Before we get into what we're going to chat about,
I'll just cut all this part.
Yeah. Before we get into all that, I'll remind you that if you're watching this on the site or on YouTube or on Facebook, you can also listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, on which more later, and loads of other podcasting platforms. So yes, what are we going to chat about? I think it's a bit boring. Talking about quarterlies is boring, but we nearly always talk about Ericsson's quarterlies because they're one of the most important companies in our
Not only
in our
quarterly, but an
world.
annual update.
And annual. It's also the most read story on Telecoms.com this week, so fair enough.
Yeah.
So we'll head off with talking about Ericsson's quarterlies. Then we've got something I didn't write up, but I'm aware of, and you have been particularly strong on over the years, a company called Sigfox, who produce a what we called an LP WAN, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So low. Basically,
they're an IoT company focused on the sort of low end stuff, the smart meter style sensors.
Okay. So well, I always think of them specifically within the technology. So there's sort of
It's very low power stuff that's meant to transmit over wide areas and be in place for years.
Oh,
it's
yeah. Well, I'll stop
bits of
it.
data, basically. Yeah.
Yeah,
and the opposite end to 6G.
And they were a sort of novel player because they've had their own MO.
Yeah.
And we'll get into how that's going. And then we're going to finish off with a Scott Self-Indulgent segment, TM, which is going to be about Spotify, and which is the host of the biggest podcaster in the world, generally acknowledged, Joe Rogan, and a rocker from the 60s, Neil Young.
Crazy Horse.
Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and things like Southern Man and Ohio, and a great protest singer. Bit of a whingy, high-pitched voice, if you ask me, but some great songs. Fair play to the bloke. Well, it's undeniable. I mean, it is whingy because
I've never been the biggest Neil Young fan.
No.
But
so would you say Bon Scott had a whingy voice? Probably.
Well, but it's not just, they're both high pitch, but Neil Young's a bit sort of, why aren't things better? Whereas Bon Scott is,
Bob Dylan is.
I like getting off my tits and shagging people. So it's
Bob Dylan
more
just
the
sounds
content.
like he smoked about 100 cigarettes before he started singing.
No, you think it's someone else.
Yeah, that's not him.
Are you thinking of Brian Johnson?
Bob Dylan?
No, Bon Scott, he said.
Oh, no, but you mentioned Bob Dylan then as well.
Oh, right. Sorry, I thought you said Bon Scott.
Bob Dylan had once upon a time.
It's very husky though, wasn't it, as well?
Not really.
It's not exactly Barry White.
No, but it's rough. It's like kind of...
I guess so. It's a bit rubbish, his voice, to be fair.
It's not my cup of tea either,
but, you know, it is what it is. Anyway, Neil Young has got the arsehole about some of the conversations that have been going on Joe Rogan's podcast, and basically went to Spotify and, you know, I mean, it was initially reported as an ultimatum. It was like me or Joe Rogan. Pierre's pushed back on that. He's saying that all he did was say, take me off. But I promise you, his initial... and which he put up on his site and then apparently deleted. His initial one was a more flouncy, me or him, and then he just rode back and went, well, just take me off because I'm not having it.
Yep.
Anyway, the broader issue is the sort of battle for control over the sort of digital domain, the public square, all that sort of thing, which I find interesting, as you know. So there we go. Why don't I hand it over to you for Ericsson to start with? I did cover it as well, but I will let you give us a top line, what you found interesting about it, Ericsson's sort of Q4 and thus full year 2021 numbers.
Yeah, I mean, I think the headline results were sort of flat sales, but up a bit organically. And the real achievement, I guess, is sort of what they did in terms of the profitability, because that was the target. They'd been aiming for this 12 to 14% operating margin, I think, by 2022.
Yeah, I've got the table up here if you want the numbers.
And I think it was about 13.7% it came in at.
13.9. Pretty close, mate. I'll give you that.
So it's like a year ahead.
Yeah, and the target was 12 to 14%, so that's top end as well.
The top end of that target. You've got to remember that going back to 2017, they were running up losses. You know, that they were sort of in crisis really into late 2016. Got rid of their CEO at the time, Hans Vestberg.
Yeah, flopped him off onto Verizon.
In the true tradition of sort of,
failed
football
upwards.
management, goes and finds another job somewhere else.
Yeah,
at the top. So he's now at Verizon, but and then this guy Boy Ekholm came in. Sort of, he's been involved with the family, I think, and on the investor side, and for a long time.
One of the biggest investor groups.
Yeah,
and he just seemed like some sort of faceless technocrat.
He did. He was very much what's the word? Like a sort of wonkish kind of figure, wasn't he? But
he was just going to come in, tweak it a bit, tighten it up.
And also sort of didn't really know anything about telecom, he was saying, wasn't he? Sort of described himself as a telecom
He was
rookie,
quite self-effacing.
Very self-effacing.
Which I think is also quite sort of Nordic, quite Swedish.
Yeah. But he did it in a good way, I thought. He comes across quite well. He's quite a sort of, even though he he could be described as boring, couldn't he? In a way, I suppose.
Well, he does, and then you
But
meet him face to face. I met him that
he's
one
actually
time
not.
face to face.
Yeah.
He came into London. Me and Ray were there.
Yeah,
And he had some beers. I got a selfie with him.
yeah.
I even showed him. I had a. I took the selfie with him. I sent it to my mate who works for an Ericsson owned company, and I said, "I'm with your boss. He says you're shit." And then my mate replied, and he went, "Tell him to give me a fucking pay rise." And I showed Boy Ekholm that, and he threw his head back and pissed himself laughing. And then he suddenly corrected himself and went, "Oh, but tell him to speak to his manager." And I was like, "Don't worry, Boy. Your first response was fine." And my mate was actually really angry with me. He was like, "How dare you?"
Yeah, well, I can imagine that.
I know. I didn't really think it
But
through.
I've never met him, but I've interviewed him on a Zoom call last year, actually, and he's actually a really interesting guy. He's got very interesting ideas about things, and isn't.
Yeah.
He's sort of image, I think, as being slightly wonkish and
Yeah, he's
straight talking and
well. He
you know,
wears sort of boring glasses and stuff.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
He's
yeah.
actually a smart guy with a personality and obviously knows what he's doing.
And I think he's, credit to him, he's done a really good job of turning the company around, which is basically to sell off things that they'd gone into under Vestberg that weren't really working. A lot of the TV stuff they were doing is gone.
Yeah.
Some of the cloud stuff's gone.
He's sort of de-diversified.
Yeah, let's just go all in on radio. We're
Yeah.
at the start of this sort of 5G revolution that's going to happen.
They've gone Radio Gaga.
Exactly. Love it.
Can't believe I've never put that in a headline.
And so, I mean, the sale of some of these units and a downsizing program, for want of a better word, has led to them being a lot smaller in terms of employees, and they've pumped the R&D resources that they have into sort of radio and increased what they're spending, and it's kind of worked out. I mean, their reputation, which I think had sort of wobbled a bit under Vestberg, and you'd seen companies like Huawei making a lot of inroads.
Yeah.
Is back. They're regarded as, you talk to experts who know a lot more about radio stuff and all that than I do, and they're all very impressed with what Ericsson does.
Well, part of
these days.
Ekholm's spiel has been, we're trying to get our margins up, but that's so we can spend big on R&D.
Yeah.
And I think it's also an acknowledgement that Huawei,
But I think spending big on R&D has also led to the improvement in margins. Once they've got more
yeah,
competitive
so it's a
products,
virtuous circle, but you've got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And I think, but also Huawei, when Huawei was allowed to participate in Western markets, I think they were massively outspending the Nokia and Ericsson on R&D.
Yeah. Now, I guess you could say that a lot of this has coincided with this backlash against Huawei anyway.
Hasn't done them any harm, has it? Except for in China,
done them any harm,
but which I'll come to as well.
But I mean, they were talking about market share changes on the earnings call, and a couple of analysts were asking about it, and they've often insisted that a lot of the gains they've made over the last few years under Ekholm haven't come from geopolitics. They've actually come from product competitiveness and not necessarily at Huawei's expense.
Way. Yeah.
And it's notable that.
Do you find that plausible?
Well, of course, because I think a lot of it's actually come at the expense of Nokia. They've definitely picked up work in a couple of core examples I can think of. Germany with Deutsche Telekom and the UK with Vodafone. They've come in and replaced Nokia.
Okay.
And
they must have replaced Huawei in some places.
They've replaced Huawei in some places as well, but they've also had a lot of success in America where Nokia's had setbacks. There was this big loss to Samsung with Verizon in the US that happened last year. And I just think Nokia's, I'm more optimistic about Nokia's competitiveness now, I think, than I was a few years ago.
Well, certainly their share price. So as I've said before, I've got about a tenner in Nokia and about 20 quid in Ericsson.
Yeah.
And my Nokia's tenner's up to about 12 or 13 quid
Yeah.
now.
I mean, a lot of that's actually to do with Nokia's obviously a much bigger company in terms of what it's involved in. There's a lot of fibre stuff going on. There's a lot of other things they do that Ericsson doesn't do. But I think the mobile side of things, they definitely slipped up. They made a couple of bad decisions and things hadn't worked out for them. They got let down by a supplier, Intel, on their product roadmap, and basically things just didn't go well a couple of years ago, and they've had to sort of right all that. And I think Ericsson's been one of the companies that's profited, because if governments are going around saying you shouldn't use Huawei at the moment, and service providers are wary of that anyway because of all the American sanctions that have made it a riskier thing to pick Huawei as a supplier. who else are you going to use? There's only Ericsson to choose, isn't there?
Yeah.
Really, in a market that's that consolidated, you've only got these three big companies. I mean, this is one of the reasons why everybody's talking about Open RAN, obviously, but Open RAN's not quite there yet. It's not quite ready. People aren't, still a lot of questions over it. It's coming, but it's coming, and it is growing.
I thought
but
actually
it's so much more
reflecting on
slowly.
last week's pod, reminded me a little bit of the one with Danielle Royston, in so much as someone came in with a reputation as being a sort of massive sort of evangelist and cheerleader, but we actually had quite a compromise. We sort of met in the middle.
Yeah.
John didn't overdo it.
No.
I mean, he still stood his ground and said he thinks it's a dog's bollocks. I don't think he ever said that precisely, but
No.
reading between the lines.
Yeah.
But, he didn't push back that hard on stuff we were saying about how, it's not a big deal now. And it's unlikely to be, we can't see how it's going to be a big deal in a few years. Now, just because he didn't push back doesn't mean he doesn't think we're wrong.
Yeah.
But it wasn't at all adversarial.
It wasn't. I mean, I think one of the issues for Open RAN, to bring it back to Ericsson, is one of the areas where Open RAN might be a danger to Ericsson and to the big kit vendors is actually in the area that Ericsson's now trying to get into, whereas it's sort of shifting its focus slightly from the service provider market, which is. There's a huge uptick in spending last year. There was a lot of investment in 5G networks, and
some of it pent up from 2020 probably.
And that market is going to plateau as we go into the mid 2020s. It's not a growth market. It tends to sort of replace 4G
it's the G
spending.
cycle, isn't it?
Totally. Yeah. So they've gone through this recovery process. They're very profitable once again. All those problems that had crept in under Vestberg have been sort of solved. But now, of course, investors are saying, well, where's the next growth opportunity?
Yeah.
That's what comes next. And we haven't seen, we've seen Ecom come in and do a very good job on transformation. The question mark is whether he can take them somewhere new. And what they've really set their sights on is this big enterprise market, selling equipment that gets used not to support macro networks for phone users like you and me, but doing deployments for factories and
so private networks,
IoT
stuff,
exactly,
that sort of thing.
And a lot of it's through
industrial telecoms.
Exactly, yeah. And that's the area where there's a question mark over how successful they can be, because it's a very young market that's in flux. Some of the decisions that Ericsson's made, actually, I think at the moment are questionable. I mean, the
like Vonage.
The Vonage is the big one, really. I think that's the first thing that,
because I think when we talked about it on the pod, we said it was a bit of a head scratcher, didn't we?
And I think it still is a head scratcher. And I mean, the share price that day when they announced the Vonage deal didn't perform particularly well.
No.
And then I remember a number of analysts who cover this market well and know what they're talking about. So Tom Rebeck, I think at Analysis Mason, give him a shout out because I quoted him quoted his blog anyway a couple of times. And Dean Bubley at Disruptive, who we've had on before, were both saying it's not a. I mean, the Ericsson's rationale seems to be that you can take these APIs, these interfaces that Vonage is developing, which are being used. Vonage's developers are using those for things like sort of SMS,
right.
and but then you can kind of encourage the developer community to sort of pivot to building them for 5G enterprise
and I suppose the
applications.
rationale is that it's only with the buy-in of the developer community that you're going to get this expansion of sort of clever ways in which industry can interface with networks.
Yeah.
And they think that by owning a bit of that developer community, they can sort of catalyse that whole scene.
That API market is selling APIs is a big market.
Right.
It's huge and it's poised for massive
really
growth.
Thought about it that much.
So their whole forecast in the presentation, were the one that's the bit of Vonage that's forecast to grow the most is the APIs business. It's pretty like Twilio, yeah? They did the same sort of thing. But this idea they've got, this logic that they've got, that the developers can pivot from doing Vonage style unified communications to 5G enterprise it's
a long game.
Yeah, it's. I mean, people are I think one of the questions is spending 6.2 billion to get that kind of capability a sensible thing? Because I mean, it basically consumes all the net cash that they have on their balance sheet at the moment, and they made. It's quite interesting on the earnings call. They were going on about how great their net cash position is, and they've been saying this for several quarters now.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, on the one that was this week, they went. Well, it's not gone yet because the deal hasn't gone through, I don't think. I think
No.
it's still being looked at, isn't it? I don't think it's been finalised. So, and then presumably when it is, that net cash position will just drop almost to zero.
Yeah.
And they were all, and so one of the big themes on the earnings call was, we don't need the net cash anymore. You know, now that we've, it's good to have a lot of net cash, I suppose, if you're loss making or if there's a question mark over growth.
So there's more cash coming in.
Well, they're a profitable firm now, aren't they, with a healthy operating margin, and they've obviously decided that it's.
I think that's a fair point. The question is, so let's say I don't know, I've got an inheritance, and from being my normal situation of basically just getting to zero at the end of every month and then starting again.
Yeah.
I've suddenly got 100 grand. If I blow that 100 grand on fuck all, that's still a waste of money.
Yeah, well,
just because I don't need the 100 grand, just because it's a bonus 100 grand.
Yeah, well, that's the question. Have they blown it on a business where they could have used 6.2 billion is a lot to spend on Vonage, I think. Now, who knows? Maybe this story that they've got with APIs will work out really well, and it will turn out to be people will look back and go, wow, what a clever move that was, and it's really sort of set them up for the 5G enterprise market. But it's a bit of a head scratcher at the moment, isn't it? Deals that are quite hard to work out and that aren't obvious.
Well, I think it's a long game, and we were kind about Boya Ekholm at the start, and he's played a long game when it comes to the fundamentals.
Yeah,
he's a sort of person, unlike Vestberg before him. He seems less impulsive. He seems more considered. I think Vestberg just thought, let's get involved in this, that, and the other. And it's some of his M&A, in hindsight, was a bit rash.
Yeah,
you just don't get the impression that Ekholm's like that. But I think his reputation for being a steady, considered person kind of rests on this. But I think what he's asking us to do as commentators, and he's asking investors to do, is go, look, man, I know what I'm doing. This is going to take a little while to play out.
Well,
this might even be a 6G play.
He's proven people wrong before, because there were a lot of doubts when he came in about the turnaround. So, as I say, maybe this Vonage thing will turn out to be a great move, and we'll all be looking back in 2 or 3 years' time and going, "Wow, look at that thing they did with Vonage."
It's just still not obvious. I agree with you now, but it's not how that's going to be.
I don't think it's just that. In the question marks about enterprise aren't just that Vonage deal. I think it's getting back to Open RAN. A lot of the service providers, when they talk about introducing Open RAN over the next few years, and we've said this many times before, they've already done the big macro deals with Ericsson, with Nokia. They're already planning the build out of those networks, and there's all these issues that they encounter when they have to try and put an Open RAN deployment into that mix to do with supporting legacy technologies and how difficult it can be to sort of manage lots of supplies in a macro network. Where they are likely to use Open RAN, I think, is in things like indoor private 5G settings and small cells, and the kind of deployments that you would do where it's completely greenfield, and you're going in and you're creating a new network from scratch that's quite small, but it's for a specific customer. And I think where operators are involved in that, and let's remember that Ericsson prefers to work through sort of service provider channels, So a lot of the time it's actually selling the enterprise stuff through those service provider channels. I think the service providers are quite keen to use alternative suppliers. I think that's one instance where they would look at it and go, maybe we should go with a Mavenir or an Altia Star,
or a kit
vendor that's not Ericsson and Nokia.
Last week when John was on, I was going, where were you in that fucking Vodafone thing? I was just being a bit of a dick.
Well, that is a
it.
macro deployment, but I think
I think maybe afterwards or sometime outside of that, he pointed out that Mavenir is involved with Vodafone and loads of other stuff, just not that particular.
And I think
macro.
some of it is actually small cell stuff, isn't it?
Yeah.
And sort of private wireless type stuff. So
it's just me getting a little below the belt shot in. That's what I do.
But so that's one issue for Ericsson. And I think the other thing is it's not just those small Open RAN sort of disruptive players. You look at companies like getting back to US big tech, Microsoft and AWS. I think that for them, 5G enterprise is quite a big opportunity. I mean, look at Microsoft's takeovers in 2020 of Affirm Networks and Metaswitch. I think that, there are some analysts who would say that really positions them to be a force in the sort of 5G enterprise market where they could be a more effective challenger to someone like Ericsson in that space. So it's a very, very...
Well, let's put a pin in that, because in our final segment I want to talk a little bit about not just the the Spotify thing, but the broader sort of land grab
Yeah.
in the sort of digital ecosystem, because people like Microsoft and Google and so on, they're constantly shuffling outside of their core areas, and they want to be a big player in other areas, and that's a good example that you just said with Microsoft there.
The other question mark as well is over the digital services bit of Ericsson, which is actually the part that's responsible for the 5G core, and a lot of that ties in with
OSS
with
sort of bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, not just OSS, the core network is like the control center of the network. So, that's software that a company would might want to use in a sort of enterprise setting.
And that's always flat.
A market they could sell that to, and it's loss making. It's been loss making for a long time. It's the bit that's sort of resisted turnaround efforts so far.
Hold on a sec. Are you talking about digital services or managed services?
Digital services.
Okay, so looking at their segment summary from just Q4.
Yeah, I'm not talking about Q4.
Oh, okay.
Because
so just Q4, basically networks provided the growth, digital services was flat, managed services was down. And my understanding had been that the real problem child, even more in digital services generally been flat to slightly shit.
Digital services made a 3.6 billion SEK Swedish krona operating loss last year.
Did it? Okay,
that's from 2.2 in 2020.
This
so it
is
might have had a
quarterly,
good Q4, but
yeah, okay,
now maybe
enough.
a good Q4 is an indicator that things are starting to come good. But
basically, all the networks carries the rest of.
But they
Ericsson.
constantly get asked about this digital services business on earnings calls, and I think investors have been prepared to overlook it because most of the money's in networks. It's in the RAN. And the argument that the answer is always the same answer, which is we're still being hurt by legacy phase outs, and it's going to take time, and as software ramps up, it will become profitable. But this has been going on for years, and the other thing is that 5G standalone rollouts are actually taking longer than I think anybody expected. It's becoming, they need that to take off really to sell the 5G core software. It needs standalone deployments by operators to actually start picking up. And outside China and a few other markets, it's taking a lot longer for operators to move to that than I think people expected. They're still very, very reliant on non-standalone, where you're sort of hooking it back to the 4G core for various reasons that I'm not going to go into because I probably get it wrong. You'd have to ask someone like Gabe, but it's just a much slower going process, I think, than anybody thought it was going to be. So that's one of the other doubts I think about Ericsson's sort of
and looking at the numbers,
performance at the moment. But
I mean, I agree that's a doubt in terms of the proportion of.
Well, it's pretty small, I know.
Yeah, so out of a total, this is in krona, I believe. Total for Q4 21, 71.5 in total, of which 51.1 was networks, 12.7 was digital services, 5.4 was managed services. The interesting thing about managed services, and everyone knows this, again, I think largely under Vestberg, they were like really aggressive in their deal making, and they basically entered into loads of managed service contracts that were never that were loss making baked in. Yeah. But I think, let's give Vestberg some credit. I think they were designed as some kind of loss leader to get in there maybe with someone big.
Well, I think so. I mean, I think you maybe you're doing it because you're selling a lot of RAN equipment,
Right.
And look, let's remember that Vestberg was there while conditions were very different when Vestberg was in charge. They had Huawei as, I mean, that was that decade, 2010 to 2020, let's say 2019, 2018, 2019 was Huawei's kick-ass decade. Yeah. 4G, they just came into Europe and basically took over.
Just we're having 4G. That.
And, we can go into all the reasons why they were able to do that, but obviously there wasn't the same kind of government pushback that there is now. There weren't the same sanctions on Huawei that there are now.
So Ericsson was having a mare.
So, and it was difficult for Eric. So they were probably having to, and given the sort of low, everybody says that they were able to undercut the Nordic vendors on pricing, partly because of, Chinese government support and things like vendor financing. But it was a fiercely competitive market, and clearly Vestberg was in a position where he had to say, look, we've got to offer something that's going to make you do deals. And I suspect some of that was, let's bundle in a managed services element here. Let's bundle a digital services component in with this contract, and it's not paid off now, but at the time it might have looked like a sensible thing to be doing.
I've got a
Chuck another one over.
Yeah, I've got a button. We're on to John Baker's Green King IPA.
Is that what we're down to now?
Yeah, well, Pierre's suddenly got a thirst on. He's on his second fucking beer. That's supposed to be for the talent, Pierre. So why don't you chuck a couple of speckled hens over? I'll stick them in the Yeti.
At least this is a daddy beer.
G&T?
No, we've still got Elena's G&Ts.
Wow.
Elena, I'd drink them if they weren't diet G&Ts. You know what I mean? I'll draw the line at that.
Oh yeah.
It's only the tonic that's diet, though, isn't it? You can't really do diet
You can't
gin.
do diet gin.
Yeah.
20%.
Okay. What are we for the time? We're still all right. So yes, just quickly looking at some other features of it. So I went with the headline. I think you headed on the enterprise stuff. I just said my headline was Ericsson shares spike, which it did about 8% as it rolls with the Chinese punches. And my point was China's down. I think it's 12% down. No, 22% down for that quarter, and it's continued to go down. And unless things change, I mean, I think it's going to be a totally fringe, if any, player.
There was one outstanding reason I think why Ericsson shares went up, which is because they raised the dividend.
Right, and their outlook wasn't too bad either. Or
but the outlook was sort of baked in, wasn't it? I don't think they made any changes to what they've been saying.
Great. Do you think I'll get?
They increased the dividend by 25%.
Like tuppence halfpenny.
So when companies do that, there's a knock-on effect on the share price. So,
well, indeed.
But I still think a lot of the concerns remain about things like them. I mean, I think the main negative for them in the bigger sort of picture, the bigger RAN picture that's happened over the last year has been what's gone on in China, really.
And so that was the point, and that was you chat to Frederick Yedling as well, don't you?
Yeah. I didn't really ask him about China this time.
Yeah, I mean, I only get about 10 minutes with him, and he's quite on message. But yes, but I always find it interesting when I'm talking to someone who's on message. That says something in itself.
Yeah.
And so part of his message was very much how we're more than compensating for China with other places. And you made the point about market share gains, and their numbers seem to say they're doing well in sort of North America, and for some reason, I know why, because the bloke in charge of it used to be Telefonica, I think, or maybe it's just because of Telefonica. Anyway,
they're doing incredibly well in Latin America and Europe. Apparently, have grown a lot, but that's not Europe. Certainly, is not to do with the market getting much bigger. They're still complaining about levels of investment in 5G in Europe. That is really all down to market share gains.
Fair enough.
And I think some of that's come at the expense of Nokia, not Huawei.
Yes, I hear you. So anyway, so they're doing all right, and we've covered the segments. I think the long and short of it is it's sort of steady but in a positive direction.
Yeah.
Numbers. There's nothing too amazing.
Yeah.
And Nokia's got its shit together, so they've got
just on the China thing, I was going to say, I know he's obviously said to you, we're sort of compensating other parts of the world. I mean, yes and no. Their sales were flat, let's remember, yeah? On the actual reported sales was 0%.
Year on year, yeah.
For 2021 compared to 2020. And people are going to overlook that when you're as profitable.
Well, actually, I think let me just quickly butt in. I think it was up 3%, which is close to flat, I'll give you that. And then they put the caveat in, which is that we're down 5 percentage points in China. So if you take China out of it, we're up 8%.
Yeah, but the reported, including China, was zero. In fact, it was actually slightly down.
Are you talking full year or quarter?
Full year sales.
Oh, okay.
232.3 billion was their sales figure last year, and in 2020 it was 232.4 billion.
Fair enough.
So they've actually gone down a bit. And
I can see the full year on. No.
And it's kind of okay. We can look at organic performance and consider things like foreign exchange effects and take out China, but it's all very well saying, we'll take out China. I mean, 2 years ago, they were on about we need to be in China because it's a really important market and it's important for product development.
That's until Sweden started getting lippy with Huawei.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden you have to sort of change the messaging a bit and say, it's not that important anymore. But actually, they'd be doing a lot better if they hadn't had those, setbacks in that country.
To be fair to them, I don't think they're saying it's not important. They're just saying, this is the deal.
There's nothing they can do about it. It's not something that they've brought on themselves, is it exactly? You know, there's not a lot they can do about it.
And then their big plus on the year-on-year comparison is
profit,
gross
surely.
margin.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, so their 2020 gross margin was 40.6%, their 2021 was 43.5%, so that's 3 percentage points margin
and then
increase,
that's fed into the operating
exactly,
margin as well.
which is why they feel they can go around chucking money around.
Yeah.
Like so many pickled herrings.
I'm just looking at the operating... Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, do you know what? When I went there as a guest of Ericsson, we went out and we had pickled herring because I wanted to, when in Rome, do as the Romans and all that. And yeah, they're good, but it's not like going to Italy or France. Or
the one thing I don't like is they have that like mushed salmon paste, like in a toothpaste tube. That's not great.
That's not ideal, is
At
it?
breakfast at the bar, they had
Imagine
that,
if you got it confused with your toothpaste.
But their bread is amazing.
Brushing your teeth with salmon.
Yeah, that'd be
Did we
foul.
say that at the same time?
That'd be foul. But like, I'm impressed by their breads. Like the bread is really good in Sweden and in Iceland. Unbelievably good.
Like sourdough type of stuff.
Oh, unbelievably good.
Denmark has terrific bakeries.
Yeah.
I mean, I know Danish pastries people,
you would say
but
bacon.
just generally the bakeries are really good over there.
Really
the bread.
good.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I've got munchies now.
Been to Copenhagen quite a lot, so
right. I've never been to Copenhagen. Is it cool?
Yeah, it's nice. It's not as nice as Stockholm. It's not as pretty as Stockholm, but it's great fun.
is it like Amsterdam? You get run over by bikes.
Not that I remember. It's a long time since I used to go to Copenhagen a lot, and it's a long time since I've been there.
Get
now,
run over
so,
by Valkyries on bikes. I mean, Amsterdam's just overrun with
I think it's 20 years.
6 foot blondes on bikes.
Well, Copenhagen does have
Do you
a lot
remember
of
last time where it was like the entire family? You had the mom, the dad, and the kids all going to like work and school, all on bikes.
It's so idyllic.
Yeah.
And they're all skinny and they're all healthy and rosy cheeked. They probably wouldn't know McDonald's if you hit them in the face.
And it
with
was in a drizzly October as well.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, but then you go to other parts of Amsterdam and people are smoking joints and there's random birds in windows. So there's two sides to Amsterdam, definitely. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's move. I think we've done that one, haven't we?
Yeah.
Okay. Sigfox. So I'll just briefly tee it up because this is mainly about your coverage currently and historically. But Sigfox exists in the IoT networking space. And the difference, the reason we need a separate networking space for IoT is because a lot of IoT, which stands for Internet of Things, is about just little embedded sensors sending very small, simple data packets back to some kind of sort of core area where the data then gets processed. So an example might be agriculture, where you've got moisture sensors in the soil or whatever, or it could be another one, transport and logistics, quite a lot. So it's the evolution of something like RFID.
Yeah.
You have a little chip that tells you where something is. That's probably how Amazon can tell you that your bit of tat that you just bought is nearly at your house. All that sort of thing. And so that doesn't need normal 4G, 5G networks. And for a little while they were falling back on 2G, but
2G was never designed for those.
It's never designed for that, and it's a decades-old technology. Yeah. So then we get other technologies, probably the best known of which is NB-IoT. And then there's other ones, but it seems like a bit of a Wild West. It's not very formed. It's not very 3GPP. And then you've got other players like LoRa, and then you've got another player called Sigfox. And Ian, you used to...
Laura, who's she?
Laura, yes. Laura Wan. Her surname's Wan. And Ian, you've just had a sort of rich history of just getting some scoops. Presumably, I'm obviously not going to ask you to reveal your sources, but presumably, you know someone who knows a thing or two about Sigfox over the years. And then most recently this week, we had, I don't think it was a scoop for you, was it?
No.
But we had a bit of news. Why don't you tell us what that news was?
Yeah, I mean, the news was, I think it was picked up by a French newspaper first,
right.
and then Sigfox.
Are they a French company?
They're a French company, yeah, based sort of around Toulouse.
So their proper name is Sigfox.
Sigfox, yeah.
Good rugby team
better than we can.
Toulouse, good sausage as well.
Saucisse de Toulouse.
There we are.
Gross.
But
Toulouse sausage. What's wrong with you?
I got in touch with them. I don't think they put the statement on their website because companies have this habit of, if it's bad news, they just send it.
burying it.
They just, well, they don't, but they just sort of send it to you when you ask for it, don't they?
Oh, right,
And
yeah.
They don't actually put that particular
Yeah.
press. But the news was that they've filed for insolvency. Basically,
Right.
they're sort of.
Which means they're bankrupt.
Yeah, they're bankrupt. It's like Chapter 11 in the
Yeah.
US. It's the same sort of thing.
You don't do it if things are going well.
No, they've got like, I don't know how. The legal complexities of it are something I didn't look into, but it looks like they've got this sort of 6-month period where they can kind of carry on operating as normal, while they get sort of, administered by the Court of Toulouse or something, and then they're basically looking for someone to come along and pick up the assets in that time. But it's. I mean, if you look at it in a really harsh way, my headline was it's over and out for Sigfox, something like that, and it's it's not something I'm actually surprised it's taken as long as it's taken for that to happen. Why? I mean, I'd probably be accused of being overly negative about this company when I used to write about them a lot. And I have to say, it's not a firm that I've tracked much over the last 2 years, because it got to the point where I just felt it was almost over for them anyway, and anything else that you wrote was almost like just piling on the misery.
I remember covering them a few years ago, but not so much
so
recently.
I mean, I think it was around about 2017, 2018 when I started writing about them a lot, and they're quite an interesting firm. I think they're founded way back in 2010 that they were founded.
In telecoms terms,
way back in telecoms terms, yeah. By this guy there's two guys, one whose name I'm not going to be able to remember off the top of my head, but he's actually the tech whiz behind it. But the more prominent sort of flamboyant figure is a guy called Ludovic Lemone, which I think is a brilliant name.
That's a cool name.
Anybody with a name like Ludovic Lemone you want to be involved in.
Ludovic's a mad name. Was it like Hungarian or something?
Or Ludo, I think he gets referred
Ludo, for
to
sure.
by people.
Ludo to his mates.
But
the Ludmeister.
They have this technology that I think dates right back to sort of First World War submarines. This very, very low bandwidth radio technology that can be used efficiently for doing things like you've said, like crop sensors or smart meters. It's the kind of unsexy bit of IoT.
Yeah.
But maybe the most important part.
Isn't that what IoT is?
Well, it might not be, because if you talk about things like connected cars, that's IoT, and people are talking about that. That's, or
I mean, to what extent
elements
is something
of virtual
like
reality could be IoT.
To what extent is it like a Ring connected doorbell IoT? It's very loosely defined as a concept.
I mean, anything's IoT. Even this is
basically-
IoT, actually. But
It's basically things that you wouldn't normally have thought be connected
Like a
become
fridge.
connected. Yeah, like the
It's
connected
the
fridge was
promo.
always
I probably should change the promo. It's very old now.
what that.
Like it's that clip where you said the connected fridge, and then Jamie says, "I'm just waiting for the connected toilet."
Good God.
it's really the kind of basic end of
Yes.
the market, and it's
Which is
tiny,
probably the more
tiny
useful
bits
end as
of
well.
bandwidth that need sending. Like a smart meter would send a reading to the electricity company every now and again, and it needs to be in place for years and years. You don't want to change batteries, and you
Because
don't
a
want
lot
it
of them
using
are just embedded in non-connected things.
You don't want it using lots of power. You want it to be super efficient, very, very low cost, because there's billions potentially of these sensors. If a company's operating millions, they want to keep the costs
And the business
down.
model's always been tight as anything, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Like, how do you charge?
Yeah, and well, this is one of the problems that they've had, I think. But they came along, and one of the reasons they looked exciting is because they had this technology that just looked like, and from what I understand and from talking to people that have sort of been involved with it, it is a really good technology.
Okay.
It is very, very efficient, and it's very, very low cost. And at the time, this is going back. You mentioned NB-IoT when you came in, but this is before NB-IoT. NB-IoT is quite a recent thing.
Yes.
NB-IoT was developed in response to Sigfox.
I see.
And LoRa's the other one. These two technologies came along. Sigfox, which is a proprietary thing, and LoRa's the other one, which I don't want to go into too much because I'll get things wrong, having not written about it for a while.
Well, my understanding when it's
a campus style technology, really.
But I also understand that LoRa is also right down there in terms of
efficiency.
I think I met LoRa at Mobile Congress a few years ago, and they showed me a little chart with just a standard 2 axes, and you had the sort of bandwidth and energy, and LoRa is down in the sort of embedded, very low energy, and then you go up, you got NB-IoT, and you got things like LTE-M, and that sort of thing. But then you go further up, you've got stuff that's got higher bandwidth, but that requires more energy.
Yeah.
So obviously you can't use it for embedded things, especially embedded things that don't have much in the way of battery life. You need the super low energy stuff.
Super low stuff.
And so I think Lower and Sigfox probably exist in a similar space.
Yeah. And then so Sigfox came along, and people got quite excited about it as a potential solution for. And they had these very lofty goals that they were going to, they were going to be one of the core technologies that's used in IoT, and they could feasibly go into billions of crop sensors, factory monitors, all this kind of equipment that, as I say, just needs to send tiny bits of data.
Yeah.
What was being used for things like, it was early days when they came along, and the only real alternatives were things like 2G, like you said, 2G, which is not a very efficient technology to use, even though it is quite widely used.
And LTE-M never seemed very convincing either.
Well, LTE-M's new.
Oh,
LTEM's a newer thing than Sigfox.
Oh, okay, all right.
The GSM, the cellular industry's response to Sigfox was to sort of panic and come out with these.
I didn't realise Sigfox was so pioneering. Oh, well, as you say, if it's from First World War technology, I guess.
It was. It wasn't that there wasn't M2M technology before, as I said, because things like GPRS were being used. That's a
little abbreviation from the past, M2M, isn't it? We don't.
Yeah,
really say
but M2M is the term that got used to describe what a lot of 2G does now. 2G still accounts for a much bigger share of the IoT market than LTE-M or NB-IoT.
Does it?
Yeah.
M2M, by the way, for people who don't know, is machine to machine.
And the cellular industry's response when they saw this sort of Sigfox challenge was to sort of be a bit panicky and rush to develop these alternatives.
Oh, I didn't realise that was the.
And one of the reasons that NB-IoT has had some another thing I used to write about quite a lot, but don't anymore, is a lot of the technical issues that you had with NB-IoT at first. It was mainly Ericsson and Huawei that were behind that particular technology, and it looked like equipment wasn't interoperable between the two of them. There were all sorts of niggles.
I remember Vodafone a few years ago banging on about NB-IoT quite a lot as well.
Yeah, Vodafone's thing was, is it Matt Beale who was at Vodafone and maybe still is, but certainly was at the time. He's now at Oracle, I think, Matt Beale, but he was.
Don't know him.
He was. Well, he spoke at our 5G World event last year. If you remember, he did one of the keynotes, Matt Beale for Oracle. But he I remember meeting him when they were talking about NB-IoT, and they just set up this lab at their headquarters in Newbury, and he was like, NB-IoT will crush Sigfox.
Yeah, he was a massive evangelist.
Obviously quoted him on that, because it's like, for someone to say something like that's quite.
So he's all
journalists love all that. But actually, that's kind of. I think the several problems with Sigfox. One has been that the market has just developed a lot more slowly than anybody expected it to. You remember all those ludicrous forecasts that were coming out a few years ago about how there'd be 50 billion IoT devices by 2020. And I think if you look at Ericsson's connectivity reports, his mobility reports that it comes out with, I don't know what the overall figure is, but certainly the amount of low power wide area ones, which is what we're talking about with Sigfox, is only about 2.1 billion, I think they were saying at the end of last year. So that the whole market's just taken a lot longer to develop for all sorts of commercial reasons, I think, and technical reasons. Sorting out the business models for this sort of thing is just I still don't think it's really there, and getting module costs down and all that sort of thing. There were all these things that have just taken a lot longer to come about, I think, than anyone expected.
Do you remember the last time I wrote, using the tag Sigfox on Telecoms.com, which I just looked up while you were talking? I will still listen to you, I promise.
Yeah.
Last time I wrote with that tag was July 2017.
Right.
And the headline was LP1 Tech Sigfox vows 95% UK population coverage by 2019. Yeah, but
2017 was when probably people were still quite excited. I think 2018 and 2019 was when I was covering a lot of the problems they were having. And as I said, the market was developing more slowly. And then NB-IoT's development, Matt Beale saying it will crush Sigfox. It's been a problem for them that the cellular industry has swung behind it, because Sigfox is. It's a proprietary technology, right?
But I think that was part of their problem as well, wasn't it? Because you've got to buy into not just the technology, but the infrastructure and the whole setup around it.
You've got to buy into the whole Sigfox ecosystem.
Yeah.
And they made these demands of. They couldn't quite make up their minds as well what they wanted to be. They've been operating networks in the US, Germany, and France.
Right.
They actually sold the German one last year, and we're trying to find buyers for the French and US ones. But at the same time, they were licensing the technology to other people. and then demanding quite a big share of revenues. I mean, I think it was 40%. What I heard from sources, that it was the sort of cut from that they were expecting.
So they were looking for too big a piece of the action.
Which is a huge piece of the action, which I think some of the sort of prospective partners that they had were kind of quite resistant to, but it would also have made things hard for them. The other problem is the module costs or the service costs, because they're trying to be competitive and they're saying it's extremely low cost. Well, yeah, that's great, but if you're only making, $1 from a device a year, and I'm not quite sure it was as low as that, but you're literally talking about ARPU levels that are a fraction of what you make on a smartphone. Your business, even with millions of connected devices, is not going to be making that much money.
So you have to silly scale for it to be interesting money.
Silly scale. Now, it just didn't scale up very quickly. I mean, they were selling their sites on 100 million connected devices, I think, a couple of years ago. The announcement that came out this week, where they were talking about what they actually supported, it was only 20 million.
Right.
And that it's actually gone up quite a bit in the last couple of years. I mean, for a while it looked like they were going to be stuck at the sort of 6 million level. But
something we don't talk about so much now, but which was very buzzwordy 5 or 10 years ago, is the word big data. And big data just basically means getting hold of a shitload of data points and doing something useful with it. And it always struck me that IoT relies on big data, and I think a lot of big data was a bit of an anticlimax. I know it still exists. We're always going to have tons of data. We've got people like Google, whatever, who bring up zillions of data points all the time. But I'm still not that convinced. And then you had catastrophic acquisitions like HP buying that company off that English bloke who ripped them off. God, I've forgotten what they're called. But those are all big data. There was like a big data mini bubble.
Well, big data was interestingly that you mentioned big data, because that was one of sort of Sigfox's pivots in the last 2 years, when it seemed like they were trying to find other ways to make money, was how we can sort of help you extract value from the data that you're gathering from all these.
Yeah, because otherwise, why would you bother? Why would you bother to pay, $1 per month per sensor?
Yeah.
To accumulate all this data, unless you thought you could do something profitable with it, and that's where big data comes in.
But they were missing financial targets. Revenue growth wasn't what they wanted it to be. They've got huge costs because of things like network build out. Trying to build out the network quite quickly.
Yeah.
And NB-IoT comes along, which just looks more appealing because it's a standard that's not owned by one company.
Yeah.
And it was
it's quite 3GPP.
And it was unlicensed spectrum. Sigfox is unlicensed spectrum, so then you've got concerns about
do you know what band it's in?
I don't know what band it's in, but you've got worries about
some low frequency band.
But you've got concerns about interference issues and things like that. So people are always going to go for a standard over a proprietary technology that's controlled by one company in wireless. That's been shown for decades. No proprietary technology is won out in the wireless industry over standardized.
We can't just suddenly turn up and do Scott and Neil networks with our own stuff going on.
So they were sort of burning through cash.
I said Neil, I meant Ian. Sorry.
Yeah.
I called you Neil.
Neil was Ray.
Ray's Neil. Yeah, that's who you must have got me mixed up with.
Why is Ray Neil?
That's his first name.
God, I didn't know
this is
that.
bad that we're putting this on the podcast, by the way.
Is that
he's going to answer to that because he brought it up.
Is that quite hush hush?
Yes.
Moving on.
Sorry, Neil.
You can edit this bit out.
Moving on.
So they were loss making. They had. Companies that are really big had invested in them originally. People like Intel, I think Telefonica took a stake. They had major French investment funds, very, very big backing kind of from the French state, really. They're sort of perceived as a French technology champion.
One of the stories I wrote in 2017, Sigfox gets vote of confidence from Telefonica.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's still the case.
Well, I mean, their message this week was that the shareholders are still behind. I mean, the reason that they've given this week for why it all went completely tits up in the end is that the pandemic basically finished them off, which I can kind of believe, but I think the pandemic just finished them off more quickly than they would have otherwise.
The signs were there.
The signs were always there.
And the fact that I haven't written them, and I'm not claiming to be a great expert on it, but the fact that I haven't written a single fucking story on them for 4.5 years.
I mean, I haven't written one on them probably for a year. I mean, we got Anne Morris, our very good freelancer, to do a good piece on them last year when they were trying to do a deal with Google Cloud, I think, for putting stuff into the public cloud, which is another cost-saving measure, really.
Yeah.
But I went off covering them because I just felt that the writing was on the wall.
You should get scoops on like senior people leaving.
This is the other thing. So Ludovic Lemon, who I mentioned, this sort of flamboyant figure. I mean, he just seemed to be this character who was quite controlling and had his own vision of how he wanted to do things, from what I've heard, and he just seemed to fall out
Everyone.
repeatedly with everybody. You know, there was this. I mean, the staff turnover at senior management level was
just silly.
Was silly. It really was at silly levels.
And presumably, one of the reasons you had,
moving on.
what I must assume is an inside source, is, you know, the reason journalists get inside sources is normally because someone on the inside's got a grievance, and they want that to go
I had
public.
inside sources, yeah.
And that person presumably had the arsehole a bit.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't just one person,
Right.
but it was mainly one person. But I had other inside sources, and yeah, well, there's no way anyone's going to work out who they are. So,
Was it Dave?
But so I just saw this. I mean, they said the pandemic had made, and I can believe this. The pandemic had made it hard to get components. Clearly, a company like Sigfox. You know, we talk about.
Well, we know about the big chip.
We talk about
issue.
the big chip problems. Now, which companies aren't doing too badly on that side of things? Apple, which reported today. Oh, that's funny, isn't it? That Apple's top of the list for people like TSMC and chip manufacturers, that they prioritise them over other people like Sigfox, for instance. But
they'll be way down the pecking order.
They'll be way down the pecking order from suppliers there. So that really hurt them, I think. And I just think that activity in IoT probably slowed down a bit during the pandemic, perhaps. But as I say, it hasn't been motoring anyway, really, as in the way that people were expecting it to back in 2012, 2013. So, and then they just had this, I think, management problems. A guy who didn't want to listen to other people who had different ideas about how it should be managed. I mean, this issue of revenue sharing with partners, where they're extracting a huge amount. I think there are all sorts of question marks.
Yeah, I always thought instinctively that their business model is a little bit weird, just because it seemed quite closed.
Yes, the closed thing's probably one of the main things, really. About why they failed.
You know, something like NB-IoT, which hasn't exactly taken off either, but at least it was open, at least it was a standard, at least everyone could get involved. So then you get things like, another thing that comes up with IoT networks is roaming.
Yeah.
You know, what's the point? Let's say you're in transport and logistics, and you've got a sensor in some container on a ship, and it's reliant on obviously wireless networks to send its data back.
Yeah.
Well, that's got to be able to roam without any hesitation at all.
Yeah, I think roaming's maybe less of a thing for Sigfox, because it would have been stuff that's not moving around, I think, was probably
so it would restrict
there.
itself to more sort of campus or static environments.
Yeah, not necessarily campus, but static stuff.
Fair enough. But yeah, you're still in a sort of walled garden type of thing.
Yeah.
Which I can see how that would put people off. So I always, you know, from my dilettante point of view, always found that a bit of a turn off.
Yeah,
if I was in that game.
They just didn't grow very. I mean, you can see the take up just wasn't where they wanted it to be. You know, their forecast a few years ago they were going to be at 100 million devices very, very quickly. And as I say, this week they cited the figure of 20 million. I mean, 20 million probably sounds quite good, doesn't it? Because it sounds like a fairly big number. But if you think about IoT, it's not like people. If you had 20 million customers in the UK that were people, human subscribers, you'd be up there with the big
sensor.
But sensors, you know, I mean, that's just a few companies doing smart meters. 20 million. This is globally we're talking about here. They just didn't scale quickly enough. The whole thing.
So they've gone into sort of insolvency or whatever.
Yeah. Which doesn't mean it's over for them, by the way.
Exactly. We should stress that the reason that exists, rather than just throwing in the towel, is some way to sort of rearrange their debts or whatever. But I can't see it happening. Can you?
The thing that look, what if people really bought into this and the technology was that highly valued, then why didn't somebody come forwards before now?
Yeah, didn't I see in some coverage that they have been trying to flog themselves?
Well, they've been trying to sell their networks. That's not the technology. That's not the IP.
Okay,
they're trying to sell networks. They sold one in Germany to a company called Cube.
Okay.
And they've sold, and they were trying to sell, I think, the US and the French networks. But that's not just how they operate. They obviously license the technology to other network builders and operators. Yeah. So there's the IP side of it as well, which one analyst on Twitter who sort of commented on my story said, well, it's not over for them. They could try and, get something from that side of things, and there could be somebody who steps in and buys it. But I just sort of think to myself, well, why hasn't that already happened? And what would you do with it if you did acquire the Sigfox IP? I mean, can it be... if people are going to go towards NB-IoT and LTE-M, which I think gets referred to mainly as Cat-M these days, by the way, Scott, for some reason, I don't know why.
Cat-M.
Yeah. But if people are going to gravitate towards those as the main technologies for sort of low power, wide area networks, and that they become the building blocks of the next standard that's incorporated into 5G and then 6G, then how does Sigfox fit in at all, really? You know, what would you do with the IP for it? I don't really understand, because all the question marks are still there, aren't they, over, you know, proprietariness and you know, interference issues and, you know, everything.
And you'd think if it was half decent, you know, we were talking about Ericsson earlier and then wanting to move into enterprise. If it was half decent and they were selling it at a song, Ericsson come in.
Someone would come in and buy it, and then they can incorporate it.
But the fact that Ericsson didn't even want to drop a few kroner on it implies there wasn't much going on there. Because I bet they had a look. And then we got Cisco. I'm trying to remember who Cisco bought a few years ago. That's what I'm just looking at.
Well, they tend not to buy people like that, do they? They would buy someone
they bought
more
an
on the
IoT
software
company,
side.
though.
Yeah, but this IoT covers all sorts of things, doesn't it? They're not necessarily the connectivity side of things.
I suppose so, yeah. I'm trying to remember, because I mean,
they do buy IoT companies
Amy
quite
used
a lot.
to cover them.
Yeah.
Anyway, it doesn't really matter. But the point is, you know, Cisco's buying IT companies. Ericsson's wanting to get bigger in enterprise. There's plenty of other players. It could be system integrators, whatever, that would have had a sniff.
Yeah.
But no one was prepared to buy it.
Yeah, so this is what makes me... I mean, I don't know how these things work. You know, maybe now that if it's gone into receivership, presumably you can pick it up for...
That was who Cisco bought, Jasper.
Right. If it's gone into receivership, then presumably you can get it for the price of a Mars bar now. And you just take on its debt, don't you, and all that sort of stuff. And isn't that how these things work? But
and if no one snaps it up, then it's obviously just worthless.
But so what assets do you get? I mean, do you get... I just don't know what value the IP holds. That's the thing. Yeah, it doesn't really support a huge amount of business.
Let the market decide. People who are going to give it much more thought than we are.
Yeah, I know.
And if they decide that it's not worth it, then the verdict has been given, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
I should actually text some of these analysts and say what value does the IP really hold, because maybe that's a follow-on
well, presumably,
story.
you're thinking of doing a follow-up.
Yeah,
as you've been a bit of an expert on this stuff.
Yeah, as I say, an expert who's not really covered the company for the last 2 years. But
no, that's it. I thought about covering it.
I
think I'd seen you on our internal thing talk about it. I was like, oh, hello. And then I went and had a little sniff around. And I saw the sort of French language insolvency stuff. And I thought, oh, I haven't got anything to say on this.
Do you know what I find funny about this, though, is that whenever I write about Sigfox or just IoT in general, it always seems to generate quite a lot of traction. You know, some articles you write and you're really kind of pleased with them, and good piece that, and then it's just like radio silence in the wider world.
Yeah, that sounds like most of mine.
Well, same here, but occasionally you write something that gets picked up everywhere and people are talking about it, and it always seems to be, for me, a lot, not always, but a lot of it seems to be IoT stuff. And things like Sigfox and
well, you know, hopefully what we do, you know, and we get some nice feedback on the pod and that sort of thing. One of the things I've always thought we do as for sort of niche-aligned journalists is we provide a sort of sanity check. There's people who are involved in all this stuff. They think about it, but they don't necessarily have a third party to sort of compare notes with.
Yeah.
So us banging on, they're like, okay, well, that's what these people... And we go into the mix, and that's what Scott and Ian have got to say about it, and that's what these other people, and this is what this analyst's got to say, and this is what this bank's got to say, and so on. And I think we just go into the mix, and, you know, in fact, that leads, unless you've got anything more to say on it, that leads quite neatly onto the final segment. Because, you know, one of the things the internet has done is just there's just a lot more public conversations going on. So what we're having now is basically, well, it's not a public conversation because other people aren't invited to join in, but it's a conversation that we broadcast or that we stick on the internet. And it's a podcast. You know, I remember when I first heard the term podcast, I thought, what the fuck does that mean? It was actually in reference to the iPod. Right. So I sort of pushed back on it. It's like Apple trying to claim it invented people recording themselves having a chat.
Is that where the expression comes from then?
I believe so.
I did wonder.
Adam Curry. Yeah. Well, I listened to a podcast, maybe it's a Rogan one, and he was talking about, you know, chatting to Apple, really early days, like Steve Jobs was really into it. So so maybe Apple deserves some credit for bringing it along, because iTunes certainly was quite early to the game in terms of the audio presence on the internet. iTunes was very much ahead of the game, and that's really what the iPod was. The iPod itself wasn't an especially impressive bit of equipment, but it had the ecosystem of iTunes around it.
The only thing it had for itself was the FireWire 400 port, I think, which made it faster to transfer.
That was also the other thing
huge
it had was
for the device. It was comically huge port,
right?
on the device.
But it was just a fatter pipe, was it?
Yeah, because like back in the day, you would transfer like 100 songs, and it would take like minutes.
Right.
Which nowadays would be
FireWire was much quicker.
Crazy. Yeah.
Right. So it's like a precursor to sort of USB and all that.
Yeah, I think FireWire is Apple's own port actually.
Okay.
And then they did 800, and then eventually it became something else.
Yeah, I know. And now we just
Thunderbolt. It's always the funny like.
Yeah, Thunderbolt I think was an Intel thing.
Was it? I thought it was theirs.
Or was that Lightning? Thunderbolt and
But
Lightning.
they're
Very,
both,
very frightening.
They're both Apple.
That's the only Freddie Mercury impression you get from me. But yes, and the other thing on the iPods that was quite
the wheel.
Yeah, the scroll wheel was a big deal at the time. Let's not forget this was kind of pre-mobile touchscreen.
Yeah, so 2002.
Yeah, early 2000s. So I mean, it's so easy to forget quite how rapid the progress is when you're in the middle of it, and you just sort of take shit for granted.
It's funny because we saw all of this. Like kids nowadays are like,
yeah,
it's always been touchscreen for me, but
yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I mean, and you used to get. I can't remember if my kids ever did it, but you get kids going up to the telly and just wondering why it wasn't interacting with them.
Oh, right.
Because touchscreens are just baked in. You see it, you got young kids.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it happened to you. You just end up with these frustrated fingerprints all over your telly.
Touch the TV and like, no.
And anyway, so yeah, podcasts. So that's what we do, and our voices, for what they're worth, just go into the mix. And the most prominent podcaster in the world, I think I know, is Joe Rogan. Me and Pierre have been fans of his for years. He seems to be, when you and I were first talking about him years ago, it still felt. I mean, he was already very popular, but it still felt a little bit niche.
Yeah, it was niche. Yeah,
it felt like, you're a fellow Joe Rogan fan, are you?
That was like 2015, yeah.
Or something like that. I think we might have been talking about it. No, I don't. I think I only discovered him about 2017. But now he's mainstream because he's a sort of cultural. He moves the cultural needle. He has a conversation with someone, and the mainstream media reports on him. It's that way round, often in an antagonistic way. Like there was a famous thing recently where he said that he got the Rona, and he'd taken all these things, including monoclonal antibodies, and then the most contentious thing he'd taken is something called ivermectin. And then CNN reported it as him taking horse dewormer, which is obviously a bad faith report, because ivermectin has human uses. It is an antiparasitic, so they're right in the dewormer thing, but it does have human uses. Yeah. So for them to characterize
also, I think it's a different. It's the same name, but it's a different. It's not the same pill, obviously.
Yeah, it's not the same pill, and and his doctor prescribed it, and his doctor didn't go, try this shit. It works in horses. It was obviously a human.
Well, it was designed to provoke a reaction, wasn't it? They knew what they were doing when they called it.
They knew what they were doing, but my point is,
I just don't understand why he released that video in the first place. Like, why? Why would he release that video? You got COVID, okay? Deal with it on your own terms.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a good question, but then he's a public figure. I don't think he has to prove anything. I think he just puts stuff up there, and I think, okay, if we're gonna give him benefit of doubt on that video, the kindest interpretation of it is he got Rona, he got over it in 2 days. He thought people should know what helped him get over it.
Yeah, but maybe he would have gotten over it without taking anything.
Maybe, but if we're going, the kind interpretation is he wanted to share the good news.
I got Rona, I got over it in 2 days.
Yeah,
right. But you didn't put a video out, did you?
So they both work. Congratulations. Can we move on now?
Okay, but I think that's why he did it.
I recommend single malt.
Single malt. Yeah.
But just burning up.
I basically sat on my arse over Christmas drinking a lot of single malt with Rona
and bleach.
I felt better.
Yeah, I did that with my cold before that. I was getting a really sore throat, and it had a really nice anaesthetic effect, knocking back a bit of Glenmorangie.
Just a bit of bleach.
And And or you could do that Trump like, maybe we could inject some of that shit into your lungs,
Yeah.
and all that.
Oh God, yeah.
Which was also
That was one of his freakiest moments, I think.
Anyway, I remember actually a Joe Rogan podcast early on when he was like, "What if you go into sauna and you breathe in like really hot air, and because they said the virus dies at a certain temperature."
So, all viruses are incredibly temperature sensitive.
But
That's
he was
why
saying,
you get a fever.
But he was saying, "Look, the sauna is higher," and then the doctor was like, "Yeah, Joe, but when you breathe it in, it cools down immediately before. Otherwise, your lungs would cook."
So that feeds into the point. What you're saying is Joe Rogan is a dilettante. He's just a curious guy who's got a massive profile, a massive audience, who just sort of gets people on and asks questions. But he gets all kinds of random people on. And so to feed into the story that I want to talk about, he got in. He gets in these clinicians, but they're kind of fringe clinicians. So he got in the guy from CNN who's part of the whole horse dewormer thing, and they had a bit of a to and fro, but it wasn't too antagonistic. But then he gets in these other people like a chap called Peter McCulloch, who's got a few little theories about how the corona response and what's best practice that run contrary to the establishment, which is very vaccine. I think we've got to admit this. This isn't me getting into that territory. The establishment mainstream response to coronavirus has been very vaccine absolutist. It's been vaccines are the response, even when it's quite clear. They talk about breakthrough infections. We know with Omicron, you were double vaccinated and boosted, and you got Omicron. So clearly, being a vaccine absolutist is not.
Yeah, but maybe I'd have been in terrible shape if I hadn't had the booster.
But that's a different point.
Yeah,
that's a different point.
Then why are you not talking about this point?
Well, because you keep fucking interrupting me. That's why. I don't think anyone thinks that the vaccines don't ameliorate the symptoms and don't make it less likely you're going to die.
Yeah.
But the vaccines were originally sold as this panacea, as this solution.
But looking at it from I'm not sympathetic, by the way, on the vaccine absolutism thing in terms of passports and restrictions. But if I'm trying to sort of take the point of view of someone in the government, I'd want most of the population to be vaccinated simply because then you have this problem with your health services.
Yes.
If the symptoms are serious and the vaccines
well, then that gets... I don't want to go too far this because this isn't Telecoms at all, but then that gets into the whole to what extent should you mandate things that might alleviate pressure on the health system, such as losing weight, such as not smoking, such as not doing dangerous sports, etc., etc., etc.
I know it does, but there's a difference between... We know what levels of obesity and other sort of health complaints they're priced in, but let's say we got 1% fatality rate or whatever, which is what the WHO I think is always stuck with, is pretty high if everybody gets it.
I think it's 0.1.
No, it's not 0.1. That's flu. It's 0.1. I mean, it's got to be higher than 0.1 because we're already at 180,000. All right, maybe that figure's overestimated, but we're already at 180,000 deaths.
Let's say it's somewhere between 1 and 0.1.
1% of the... That's definitely not anywhere near 0.1. It's 1% or over. 1%.
If only we had Jamie here. We should turn you into a Jamie where you can look this shit up.
1% at the lower end of the estimate for the fatality rate.
Okay. Well, let's say it's 1%, whatever. What's your point?
So 1%, if you've got 1% of your population that's going to die of coronavirus if they're exposed to it, then that's a massive crisis that you don't get with standard rates of cancer and obesity and
any
stuff
other
like
transmissible disease.
Totally. So if I'm trying to be sympathetic to a government perspective, it's like, look, if 500,000 people in the UK die because of coronavirus and another several million are going to need
and we've got all those
treatment,
Neil Ferguson
that's
projections.
a disaster.
Yeah.
And vaccines is the only sort of way to sort of stop that from happening, let's be honest.
Well, is it? But
or
anyway.
A lockdown then.
Or lockdown or other therapeutics, such as monoclonal antibodies. And this is the point. Getting back to people like Rogan, alternative voices. I'm not arguing for or against any of these things. The point of me bringing this up is just having other voices. So the reason I teed it up as vaccine absolutism on the part of the state and the establishment is I'm saying that it's not the panacea that they once thought it would be. Fine. It's still a really good idea. I was double vaxxed. I just haven't bothered to get boosted because I got fucking Rona in December. I figure I've got natural immunity for at least 6 to 12 months. So I'm not going to bother with a booster. But I got the vaccines without hesitation, so I'm not an anti-vaxxer.
Yeah.
But they also... I still got the Rona despite being double vaxxed.
Yeah.
And yes, it wasn't bad. So the other person that Rogan got on recently, which seems to have caused this kerfuffle, to bring it back to the segment, is a guy called Malone. What was his first name? I want to say Karl Malone, but he's a basketball player. Anyway, yeah, Moses
This
Malone.
is the most random segment we've ever had on.
Anyway, he got this doctor. He got this clinician on called Malone.
I don't know, because see, I avoid those podcasts. So like, it's just going to be like,
Oh, they're really interesting. And this guy was one of the original researchers of the mRNA technology years ago, not the current manifestation of it, but the whole concept of getting mRNA, which and packaging it up in a little lipid coating and getting it into your body such that it can send instructions to these little organelles in your cells called
Dr. Robert
Malone, called ribosomes to produce proteins, and so that's how this is how the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines work. Is they send mRNA into your cells and say produce this spike protein, which will then cause your immune system to go, oh shit, spike protein, let's get ready for it.
Yeah.
And that's the basic premise of vaccines, is to precondition your immune system to be ready for it when the main event comes along. And Malone just has expressed various points of skepticism about this, that, and the other. And there's all sorts of, does it cause myocarditis in young men? Does it do this? Does it not do that? Is it overpromise on this? Is this underplayed? And those are all legitimate questions, as far as I'm concerned. The problem is, as the area you were pushing back on, people go, well, but then if that makes people not get the vaccine, then that's bad. And so anyway, that's
I say that, but I don't think there should not be a discussion about it.
I know you're being devil's advocate to a certain degree.
I want those discussions to be had. It sounds stupid that anybody wouldn't want to have those discussions.
Well, but Neil Young...
But that's the world we live in.
Neil Young, the musician from the 60s, who's apparently still alive,
76,
reckons those discussions shouldn't happen. And he and the story was, the kerfuffle this week was, he got in touch with Spotify because Rogan, about a year or two ago, went wholesale on Spotify. They chucked about 100 million fucking bucks at him just to go and have chats on Spotify.
By the way, it's probably way more, actually.
You reckon?
There's many rumors that all his friends were like, I heard the number, it's way more.
Wow.
So...
So he's just
maybe it's like 100 guaranteed, and then if you hit those basic points, you'll get like 150.
And by the sounds of it, thanks in large part to podcasts like this, he's probably smashing it, because he's become, especially in the States, but globally.
SNL, it's been talked on SNL now.
Yeah, he's become part of the global discussion, and so Neil Young goes, initially, this is what I read, and he has put stuff. He's got this rather sort of old school looking website. That's formatted like an old school front page of something like a New York Times.
He does it himself, does he?
By the looks of it, and doesn't spend too long on it either. It's called. Has
it got capital letters everywhere?
Yeah, the URL is neilyoungarchives.com. By the way. Anyway, apparently he posted something up which has been taken down, where he basically went, right, either take Joe Rogan off or me off. But Pierre, when we were chatting before, pushed back on that, and maybe that's bollocks, but I read that somewhere. It's certainly not up there now.
It's just the text that I read was saying you can have Neil Young or Joe Rogan, not both. It's not really saying... I mean, the opening sentence was like, take down my music, please.
To be honest with you, whether he said one or the other is absolutely stupid. It's like somebody saying to the BBC, oh, there's this programme that you showed, a few years ago, and it's still in your archive, and you can get it on iPlayer. And I don't like that person and what they said, therefore I'm not going to. I don't want to. It's the same sort of thing, or like it's like an author going, "There's some books in this library that I don't agree with the point of view they're making, so I don't want my book stocked in this library." Or
back in the day, you'd be a newcomer on the BBC, you'd be like, listen, I don't like Top Gear. It can be me or Top Gear. And they would say, fuck you, Top Gear makes so much money.
Well, there's a classic case, because how many BBC people do you reckon didn't like Top Gear when it was? Clarkson's
quite a polarising figure, isn't he?
Well, a lot of people hate Joe Rogan from Spotify. Yeah.
So it's just this thing about
I
going
think he obviously
saying,
knew that his music would be taken down.
Yeah, and so
is that what they've done? Is that the decision they've taken?
I think his point is that he's hoping probably that other artists would follow suit. And
I think Neil Young. I mean, Neil Young's obviously got a conscience. He was known as a protest singer. He sung about the Kent State when the cops shot loads of students back in the 60s. He sung about this, that, and the other. He's an important voice, just as Rogan's an important voice. So is Neil Young.
Other people should be important voices.
Well, yeah, and the thing I found weirdest about it is, I'm looking at Neil Young's website here. That it's headlined his little segment, Spotify in the Name of Truth, and this is the problem with people like Neil Young. He claims to be the arbiter of truth.
Yeah.
Whereas he's just some crusty old fucking hippie who's quite handy at writing songs. But that doesn't qualify him any more than anyone else, any more than Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
And also, of all the things he could freak out about, when you considered he's complained about sort of Vietnam, he's complained about racism, complained about these big ticket issues, and now he's moaning about some people going on Spotify that he thinks are too vaccine skeptical for his taste. It just strikes me as a sort of very minor thing.
I find the pandemic's done this. It's actually it's brought some real nutters out of the
polarizing.
It's been incredibly polarized. Like you say, that for all things to people to get wound up about, for it to be that, I just find quite bizarre, really. That people, and it's become fanatical almost in some quarters. That this. Well, the Australian government has become fanatical about it. You know, the whole Djokovic...
Yeah, New Zealand... And
he doesn't do gigs anymore, so he has too much time on his hands.
But the whole Djokovic issue that happened this year with him not being allowed into Australia because he'd... You know, it started off with him not wanting to have the vaccine.
Yeah.
He gets given an exemption by the state government, the sort of local government authorities in Tennis Australia, on the grounds that he had coronavirus in December, flies in, gets his visa cancelled, appeals it, wins that. Then the government says, he could be a bad influence on anti-vaxxers.
Yeah, it might just give people funny ideas.
It might give people funny ideas. It's
he's weird. I think he's a no vaccines.
Yeah, he's got
this weird
theories
thing about his
nutrition
body
and what he puts in his body.
No, but he cried apparently when they told him you really need this elbow surgery. He didn't want to get this elbow surgery. Yeah,
right.
Because he was like, you're going to put drugs into me and stuff. He just didn't want to.
Do you know what the problem with this sort of view?
But he's also one of the most ridiculously athletic people ever, so he must know what he's doing a bit.
But I think one of the things
surgery.
One of the things that makes it seem so outrageous to me, though, is that the Australian government has obviously made its mind up that, I mean, what you were saying, like who is someone to say that I'm right and you're wrong? And it's not as though Djokovic is an outlier. If you go to his home country of Serbia, vaccine skepticism is widespread. And it's actually widespread in Eastern Europe. Most people in Serbia, I don't think, have been vaccinated. Right. And the cultural background to that is something that the average Australian muppet like Scott Morrison wouldn't understand. You know, it's all very well growing up in a democratic country where you go and get your vaccines done when you're younger, and these are things that save lives. And it's a completely different environment from growing up as part of the Eastern Bloc, where there was lots of dodgy medical stuff going on, and people are very sceptical about government
and you have
authorities.
that even within Western countries like the US, where certain ethnic demographics are much more vaccine sceptical, and there is some historical reason for that.
I think people have become incredibly unsympathetic towards these other
it's absolutism. This is my point, and this is to bring it back, because we're going to have to wrap this up in about 5 minutes.
Yeah.
What I think's interesting about it in a more sort of digital economy way is, Neil Young's Neil Young, whatever. You know, no one was talking about him. Now we are talking about him a bit, but he's taken a hit. You know, apparently 60% of his streaming revenue is coming from Spotify, which isn't surprising.
Yeah,
and he's just come off. And if he's taken a principled hit, then fair play to him. He's entitled to do that.
Probably doesn't need the money though.
Well, he's probably all right.
Who knows what he's done with his cash? I don't know.
Whatever, but he's still, there are very few rich people who then go, okay, I'm just going to not have this money. Yeah. It's a battle control, and the even broader issue. So, one of my bugbears is censorship, and what Neil Young is basically asking is for Joe Rogan to be censored, because Joe Rogan had people on who talked about stuff that he didn't like.
Yeah.
Now, granted, he would frame it as causing harm. And there's some argument, as we were just chatting with Pierre, if someone's just banging on about ivermectin and people are relying on that instead of getting vaccinated, it could cause them harm.
Yeah.
But that's the individual's choice.
Yeah.
I mean, I chose to get vaccinated, but I've chosen not to have my teenage kids vaccinated. These are all choices that we all make. It's when they're mandated from above, and when there's only one approved line of thinking, not just talking, but thinking. And so Neil Young, weirdly, is going for that. And he's calling for Joe Rogan to be censored. And we're getting this in other areas where there's basically a sort of battle for control of the public square and a battle for control of the digital world. So we've chatted before about, Facebook and Meta. What if everyone does start doing this Ready Player One / Matrix thing, where we exist almost entirely? In fact, we chatted about it last week, didn't we?
Yeah.
Where we exist entirely in this virtual world, and it's all fucking run by Facebook.
Yeah.
Well, presumably Facebook could then start censoring activities, speech and activities in that space. Google, Andrew just wrote a piece about Google keeps buying into Indian telecoms companies. Well, it's not just doing that for the good of its health. It presumably wants to have some influence over them. And there's another story that we're looking at today. I think Andrew wrote that up about the FTC hassling Facebook over scams going over social media. Again, it's a battle of control. So the way I view it is this massive battle for control over the public space. I think it really kicked off in 2016 when we had these two big electoral anomalies going on, which was Brexit and Trump.
Yeah.
I think that alarmed the fuck out of the establishment so much that they're sort of scapegoating social media, or maybe they're not. Maybe social media really is as influential as they fear it is. But it's also a variable, like Rogan is a massive variable. It's something they can't control. So there's all this opinion being formed. There's all this conversation happening outside of their sphere of influence. They can influence CNN. They can influence the BBC. They can't influence you and me chatting about some shit on Facebook, and they can't influence Joe Rogan getting on some random guy who's got a different idea about vaccines. So that is what I think is interesting about this. I'm not even coming down on one side or the other. I'm not necessarily pro Rogan, although I am. I'm a big fan of his. What I'm really pro is everything being out there.
Yeah.
There just being a massive free-for-all chat. Yes, I mean, the flip side of that is there are bad actors. There'll be people who try and sell you snake oil. There will be people who jump on an anti-vax thing because they've got some other agenda. There'll be just instinctive contrarians. And so we've all got to constantly be aware. But this is what I try and teach my kids. You've got to learn to filter this stuff. You can't rely on the state to say this is good information, this is bad information. You've got to be able to take it all in and make your own mind up. And censorship doesn't allow you to do that. Censorship says there's only one person who knows what's correct, and it's me.
Yeah.
Who the fuck are you?
People can't think for themselves these days. That's a problem.
Well, I don't know. I think that might be slightly overstated. I think people can. And, you know, to bring
Some
it back...
don't want to.
To bring it back to Rogan, the fact that Rogan is so popular, I think shows that there's a real appetite for... You know, because he just had Jordan Peterson recently. Pierre and I were chatting about this offline. Chatting for like over 4.25 hours, something like that,
Yeah.
on fairly intellectual stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, you might think a lot of it's bollocks, but it's conversation at a fairly elevated level. The fact that there's an appetite for that, I think, shows that people really do want to think for themselves. And Joe Rogan is providing stuff that the traditional media is failing to provide with their little 30-second adversarial segments that don't really tell you anything.
Yeah.
He did say something that I remember. I thought it was a good sentence. He said, bad speech shouldn't be censored. Bad speech should be replaced with good speech.
Yeah. And there's other analogies. They say the sunshine is the best disinfectant and all that sort of thing. Yeah, you know, let's say on this podcast, it's not often that Ian and I disagree, but let's say I said something really sweeping. You know, maybe I said, I don't know, something we were talking about earlier, that I think Ericsson's going to go bust or something like that. Then the thing to do is not to censor me for saying that, but for Ian to go, Scott, this is why you're full of shit.
Yeah.
That's how grown-ups act.
Yeah.
It's only sort of despots, authoritarians, and just very intolerant people who call for things that they disagree with to be erased. So yes, I think it's interesting. So I'm pleased, in summary, just to round it off, and then we'll call it a day. Basically, Spotify has always stuck by Rogan. Spotify gets calls for Rogans to get taken down on an almost sort of weekly basis now. They've stuck by him, due in no small part to the fact that they've chucked north of 100 mil at him. But I think they also just think, look, we're just a platform. Okay, they have conversations. There might come a time where Rogan gets someone on who says something so inflammatory that it's an issue. But I think that bar should be high, and Spotify seems to agree. So bad luck, Neil Young. We'll see where he goes. It probably won't have done him that much harm. I mean, his profile's probably as high as it's been for about 40 years, anyway. But I'm pleased Spotify made that decision, and yeah, long may it continue. Cool. All right, we never got into those speckled hens. That's probably for the best as we're going out.
Yeah.
Those Green King IPAs weren't too bad.
Yeah, pretty good.
All right, nice one, John. Thank you. Right, we'll wrap it up there. Thanks a lot for listening, and make sure you join us for the next one.